Good day, everyone. My name is Chip Coldren. I'm the Managing Director for Justice Programs at the CNA Institute for Public Research. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance for Smart Policing, and I will provide the introduction for today's webinar. Welcome to the Smart Policing Initiative webinar on collective efficacy. And I want to thank everybody who has joined in today for your interest and participation. Our colleagues, Craig Uchida and Shellie Solomon, will present this webinar, along with Wynn Mawa from Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Craig and Shellie are with Justice and Security Strategies, a research evaluation and training firm that has been involved with several smart policing sites as a research partner, and that has successfully undertaken a number of justice system improvement and reform projects, including several regarding collective efficacy in policing. Wynn is the project coordinator for the Smart Policing Initiative in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. She has coordinated a very interesting application of collective efficacy principles, working with Craig and Shellie, and with the research team from George Mason University. As many of you know, this is one of a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA, the technical assistance and training provider for the Smart Policing Initiative. We thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its longstanding support for smart policing, and as I like to say, they don't just support it, they champion it. We also thank Craig, Shellie, and Wynn for the effort in putting this webinar together. I'm particularly pleased to introduce this webinar on collective efficacy because I was part of a research team almost 20 years ago that conducted original research in Chicago that coined the concept of collective efficacy. Back then, it was strictly a theoretical concept, and I thank Craig and his colleagues for the work they have done to operationalize this concept and bring it into the everyday working of policing. Just permit me to make a few other comments, and then we'll move towards the webinar. As you probably know, this webinar is recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our website. There will be opportunities for questions and participation during the webinar, so please make your thoughts and questions known. I can assure you that others will appreciate hearing what you have to say. Immediately following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete the evaluation and please give us your honest thoughts and recommendations for future webinars. Now, let me also thank Vivian Elliott and Zoe Thorkelson at CNA, who do the background work to make sure these webinars go smoothly. Vivian is going to go over a few logistics, and then she will turn the webinar over to Craig, Shellie, and Wynn. So thanks, Vivian.
Great, thank you, Chip. Just wanted to let everyone know, as Chip mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. We will post it onto the Smart Policing Initiative website. That's at www.smartpolicinginitiative.com, along with a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation today within the next couple of weeks. We do want to draw your attention to the chat feature here today in the WebEx platform. Feel free to share any questions that you have during the webinar in the chat feature. We will be monitoring that and making sure we answer any questions that you may have. There will be a few moments where we'll take questions verbally from the audience as well. I just want to also remind everyone that if you are on your phone or computer, we ask that you put your phone on mute, not on hold. Otherwise, we will get some very lovely, interesting background music. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters, Craig and Shellie.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you, Chip, and everyone at CNA for putting all this together with us. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you all in the audience for signing on and listening to this. I do want to give a shout out to my friends that are on from the LAPD, from Youth Policy Institute, from San Francisco, Miami-Dade, and elsewhere too. So thank you for joining us. Let me just give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm in Los Angeles, so it's morning. I know it's afternoon elsewhere. We're going to just do a brief discussion about crime prevention and crime control, talk a little bit about public trust, and then really get into collective efficacy and what it means and what it does. We'll talk about how collective efficacy works with community policing, and Wynn will give specific examples of how collective efficacy actually is operationalized in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Finally, we'll talk about what you can do to implement collective efficacy, and then take questions from you all in the time that remains. So first, let me talk about crime prevention and crime control and public trust. One of the things that we think that collective efficacy can do is prevent crime and reduce crime. And the questions obviously are how does that happen? How do we reduce and prevent crime? And we think that collective efficacy can have a huge impact in that area. The second concern is how we get communities, neighborhoods, and people to actually assist in a crime control effort. Right now, there's a huge reliance on police to control crime, and rightfully so, but there's also a huge component where communities, neighborhoods, and people can get involved in crime control and in informal crime control methods. The big question I'm sure that many of you have is how do police play a role in this, in collective efficacy? What's in it for them? What does it take? What does it involve? And lastly, there's a great concern right now for how police can improve and increase their trust with the public. That with Ferguson and other incidents over the last 2 years, there's been a huge demand for the police to engage more and to regain, I think, the public trust that they've lost. And we think that collective efficacy can play a very strong role in that. A lot of this is based on what the thinking that's out there about public trust, and drawn in part from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. That the first pillar of what the task force has discussed is building trust and legitimacy, and that the police should proactively promote public trust by getting involved in things that are non-enforcement related. And that's where collective efficacy comes into play. So what is it? What is collective efficacy? What does it mean? What does it involve? There are 3 different components to this. First and foremost is a willingness to intervene. And we'll talk extensively about that. A second is that of social cohesion and trust, and we'll talk and define that a little bit more. And third is the ability, frankly, to mobilize informal social control mechanisms. So what is collective efficacy in real terms? And one of the big questions is how willing are residents to take responsibility for what goes on in their neighborhoods? How much social control and social cohesion and trust can people engage in? And if they do engage in it, we found that when those things are high, when willingness to intervene, when social cohesion is high, when informal social control is high, then crime is low and disorder is low as well. When we talk about social cohesion, we're talking mostly about trust in the community itself, trust in the neighborhood, and really a sense of belonging within the community. More importantly, I think we found that it's also how much of an investment do people put into their neighborhoods. how much of a social investment do they make on their streets, in their neighborhoods, and in their communities overall. And trust is really the backbone of all of this, both for the community and for the police. And so it's an inherent part of what goes on, and the question really becomes how much trust exists within a community and between neighbors and between the police and the public. The notion of willingness to intervene, I think, is really critical to how we behave in our neighborhoods and our communities. One of the things that happened in 2013 in Cleveland was that 3 women were taken hostage by a kidnapper in a regular neighborhood in the city of Cleveland. And they were held hostage for almost 10 years. And 3 women and 1 woman had a child during this time. And the question really that you start to ask is, what was going on in this neighborhood? And while I think obviously the hostage takers were to blame for all of what was going on, really the big question is, why didn't anyone notice this? Why didn't someone say something? Did the residents know each other? Did they know who lived in this house? How isolated were they from each other? And basically, too, how trusting were they, and or how fearful were they of what was going on so that they didn't do anything about it? And so this does raise the question of, what can we do and what are we willing to do in our neighborhoods to assist with safety issues and crime prevention?
I think that Craig has laid out one of the most extreme cases, but I think generally when we live in our communities, when you look at collective efficacy, it is a question of how willing are residents to step in, for example, when there's teenagers or homeless who are hanging out on street corners and intimidating passerbys. I mean, are the residents willing to say something? Are they willing to ask people to move along? Are they willing to organize and figure out how to address these problems? If they see kids painting graffiti on the walls, are they willing to say something to them? Are they willing to call the police? Are they willing to go out into the communities and try to erase the graffiti in a timely manner? Or are they just going to let it go and move to another community? What is their ability to step up and deal with this ongoing problem? And back to the more extreme levels, but if you hear a fight or if residents hear a fight, a loud argument, are there actions taking place? Does the community sort of gather around and watch the fight? Or are they stepping in to break it up? Are they calling the police? Those types of activities are elements of collective efficacy in terms of how the residents react to them. Will the residents step in and prevent these? In this case, there's graffiti of a foul nature on the side of a school in a mural that the students have painted. And the question is, do the parents keep their kids in the primary school, or do they just talk about it and then move their children to another school? Do they go back out and repaint it? What are the choices that they make in this neighborhood when faced with this type of a gang problem?
So one of the questions that we get a lot of are about community policing and how collective efficacy plays a role or is part of or even may override community policing principles. It does not. It's very closely tied with the principles of community policing. But I think that collective efficacy takes us deeper than what we've seen in community policing over the years. One of the things, I was the former assistant director for the COPS office when we first started up the COPS office in the 90s. And one of the things we always looked for were how police departments were engaging the public and actually getting involved in community policing. And we always knew that community policing involved three different concepts, and those were community engagement, certainly, and problem solving, and organizational change. When we talked about community engagement back in those days, and even today, police departments always pointed to their programs of neighborhood watch, of police advisory or police community advisory boards where they would meet with community folks and meet with businesses and so forth. And those to me were all fine, well, and good, and certainly part of community policing. But they never got really deep into situations and concerns about the community in what I considered real ways. And what I found with collective efficacy is that, and I've written here, community engagement on steroids, because I've seen and I think the police can become much, much deeper involved in communities. And you'll see this as an example when we get into Brooklyn Park. But the ability to form strong relationships within neighborhoods and with people, it doesn't have to be community-based necessarily. It can be individualized. It can be neighborhood-based. But the difference for me with all of this is that collective efficacy can be very deep and can go as deep as possible, frankly, with the relationships with the community. It also, I think, has meaningful goals and outcomes that we can actually measure willingness to intervene and the levels of informal social control that people start to exert. We found that there's more satisfaction with police because of the way in which they engage and work with communities. There's also an effect on fear of crime. That, again, because they're more involved with crime control and social control, they have less fear of crime and are less likely to not walk in neighborhoods at night and also be more likely. Okay, next slide, Shell. So part of what we're going to try to address in this next section are these questions. First of all, is what do police do? What do patrol officers actually do? What do community members do? And how does it get done? How do we know that we're implementing collective efficacy? And a lot of this is then research-based, and I'm going to turn to Shellie to talk about what we found in research and what's going on in other parts of the country as well.
We did a multi-year study in Miami-Dade County where we did a number of almost 900 door-to-door surveys in 8 neighborhoods. And then we did systematic social observations and also looked at crime data from all of the neighborhoods across Miami-Dade County. And what you see in the map there is a Kriging map where we're looking at the survey data and a factor analysis measure of collective efficacy. The dark blue areas are where collective efficacy was high, down to the yellow areas where collective efficacy was low. And what we find is that crime goes down in places where collective efficacy and social cohesion are high. And this held for across all 8 neighborhoods. The other thing that would point out here is that we saw that these measures vary a lot in very small areas, a matter of a few blocks. There's a lot of difference of opinions and perceptions and willingness to intervene within a few blocks of each other. So neighborhoods vary at micro levels. This is currently being implemented in other areas in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, in Los Angeles. Other sites that are doing it are Austin, Texas. Miami-Dade is continuing to do this activity. as Chip mentioned at the beginning, he worked on a project 20 years ago, and what they found was that the decision to intervene, the decision to do something about incidents, has a stronger influence on crime than race, ethnicity, or income. Collective efficacy and social cohesion can have a really game-changing effect on how a neighborhood operates. So when we look at this, one of the questions is it community organizations? Is this collective efficacy? And, in answer to that, I always say, and Craig says that in some cases it can be if folks are organizing to address a problem in their neighborhood. It depends on where you are in the spectrum of your planning. It doesn't have, collective efficacy doesn't require community meetings, but it can have community meetings. So what do we do, Craig?
Yeah. So, the big question is, so what, right? We have research as the basis for this. We're trying to put it into practice, but the big question of, okay, so what? What do we do? And part of the strategy we lay out for all of this, and again, this goes back to some principles of community policing, that, you should engage in problem solving. We found, too, as Shellie just mentioned, that micro places, micro targets are good places where you can start to build collective efficacy. That you begin to identify assets and what we call anchor points, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Coalescing and organizing the community can take place. It's not essential because individuals can engage in collective efficacy without community-based organization. And lastly, we found that volunteerism, in the sense of working together on individual projects or cleaning up a park or something of that nature where you get volunteers involved, helps to build collective efficacy quite a bit. And I mention that because part of what happens, and I think, and we're going to talk about this with respect to Brooklyn Park, people start to network at anchor points and through different projects that go on in your neighborhoods. So if there is a park cleanup and you bring people in to help do that, it's not just a matter of cleaning up the park. It really is building relationships. You start to have people talk to each other. You start to have people recognize each other and get to know each other primarily. And in doing that, you build a network. You start to build trust. And this, again, is where relationships become very, very important. That part of what we don't do a lot of anymore in our communities is get to know our neighbors. I don't know my neighbors that well, and I've lived there in my house for 20 years. But part of what happens in the wintertime where I live in Maryland, when it snows, and it snowed about a month ago, and I had 30 inches of snow on my driveway, my neighbors came out and helped me get that snow off the driveway. And just getting to know them in that kind of way helps a lot. It's that kind of trust and it's that kind of relationship building that we're talking about here. Simple things, but very important things as well. So I want to turn this over now to Wynn, who will talk now about how they're doing things in Brooklyn Park and the project she's involved in. So Wynn, go ahead.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Am I on the line?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Thanks, Craig and Shellie and the entire team for the invitation to speak today. I'm very excited to talk about what Brooklyn Park is doing. Again, my name is Wynn. I'm the project coordinator for the Brooklyn Park Police Department, overseeing the specific SPI project focused on building collective efficacy. But before I get into exactly talking about what our patrol officers are doing to help build collective efficacy, I want to give you guys like a quick snapshot of Brooklyn Park and the background to our program. So Brooklyn Park is roughly about 27 square miles and with just over 77,000 residents, of which those 50% are non-white and 20% are foreign-born. And so as a police department, we really believe that the police play an important role in bringing the community together. And so if you look in front of you in your screen, our SPI project goal is really focused on developing and testing a policing program that helps patrol officers build collective efficacy at hotspots during their discretionary time. And as Craig and Shellie mentioned earlier, if social control, cohesion, and trust is high, then crime and disorder is low. So we hope that by building or increasing collective efficacy in Brooklyn Park in these high crime areas will ultimately reduce crime and increase community police relationships. Okay, so then we, along with our researchers, came up with and developed an actual process. It's known as our three-stage process where we would be able to build collective efficacy in these high crime areas. And this process is known as ACT, A-C-T. And ACT is the acronym for the 3 stages of building collective efficacy. And of course we have to have acronyms because everything has to have acronyms. And so the first stage of building collective efficacy would be asset identification. Followed by the second stage, which is coming together, and followed by the third stage, which is taking action. And I'll talk a little bit more about these specific stages later on. And so through these 3 stages, through ACT, we hope that residents will actually learn how to build collaborations to enhance informal social controls. And so our actual intervention is in operation for 1 year, and we created a timeline that would really reflect these 3 stages. And so for stage 1, asset identification, we decided that it would take about 2 months to implement that stage, followed by the second stage of C, which would take about 5 months, and then followed by the last and final stage, which would take about another 5 months. Well, we started intervention last year in July of 2015, and so we're currently 8 months into intervention right now in our last stage. And so with our officers, you know, what did this mean for them? And so their responsibility for this entire project was to successfully implement ACT in treatment areas during their discretionary time. And on top of that, they had to track their efforts in a database which was accessible through their phones. And throughout the entire process, throughout the entire implementation, we wanted them to continue to maintain relationships with all the assets that they've built and continue to do so even after intervention. And so to prepare our officers for actually implementing ACT, we had to provide a rigorous 1-day training for all of our officers. And so what this training entailed was explaining the actual theory of collective efficacy. We train them on exactly what it is, how it can increase informal social control and everything. And if you're a police officer or you've worked with police officers, you know that officers are actually really action-oriented. So it was a challenge trying to take a theory and trying to explain it and trying to put it into practice. And so we included in our training how they could actually apply their knowledge of collective efficacy into practical strategies for community building such as ACT. And on top of that, we also provided them how to build relationships and trust with residents, and not only just building relationships and trust with residents themselves, but learning how to teach residents how to build those relationships and trust with each other to enhance informal social control. So then that still leads us with the question, what exactly are our trained officers doing through ACT to build collective efficacy? So prior to our intervention, our research partners identified 42 hotspots in Brooklyn Park. And when I'm talking about hotspots, I'm not talking about a large geographical area. I'm talking about very, very micro areas. Oops, can you go back to the, I'm talking about very micro areas. And so these areas are street segments, so single street blocks. And so we have a variation of hotspots that are street segments and apartment complexes. And so ACT is currently being implemented in 21 areas of our 42 hotspots in Brooklyn Park. And how we did this operationally was we have about 45 patrol officers, and we assigned one day shift officer with one night shift officer to one treatment area. So we basically have 21 teams of officers in 21 treatment areas. And so how did they actually do this? How did they actually implement the 3 stages? And so again, the first stage is the asset identification stage. And this stage is mainly, the goal is to mainly identify at their treatment level who is willing to intervene, who is willing, and who are the assets. And so their goal was to gather as much information as they could about their hotspot. So basically connecting with their resources internally and externally, talking to our specialized units, our cops, our crews, our crime analysts, our crime prevention, and then even talking to city inspectors, getting to hear from them when they went out, if they were able to inspect a house that was abandoned. So getting to really know their area. And then after they got to know their area, their next goal was to get to know the people in their area. So making contact. And a lot of our patrol officers did the traditional. They went out on a foot patrol, and they actually talked to people hanging out, and that's how they got to know their assets. Some officers even took it to the next level, and they did random knocks and talks, just going out randomly during their discretionary time, knocking on doors and talking to people, getting to know people. We also created flyers where we sent out to our hotspots, so all of the residents would know what was going on in case they saw an increase of police presence. And on top of that, our officers, some who are way above and beyond, even went about to looking at call reports in their specific hotspots and identifying and contacting the reporting parties, because they believe that if the reporting parties made a call, they would be willing to be a part of the program. And so during this entire process, this entire stage, our officers maintained relationships and started to build trust by always checking in with their assets and following up. And on top of this, our officers even made contact with liabilities. And so very, very, very amazing. And this is just an example of one of the flyers that we sent out to our hotspots. Very simple and colorful. Tired of crime in your neighborhood? Tired of no one doing anything? Are you ready to take action? So if you have any questions later on, I'll be available towards the end to answer questions. And so once our officers were able to identify assets, they transitioned into the coming stage, coming together. So the goal of this stage really is to start to build a foundation of trust, not only police and community trust, but trust between the residents, and start to build relationships and shared expectations. And the second goal is then to really start to identify issues or concerns that the residents are having in their neighborhood. And then leading to the third and final goal, starting to actually develop solutions in response to those identified issues and concerns. And so in order for our officers to do this, they had to do things outside of their norm, outside of just answering a call or responding to a call. So they had to bring these assets together. They had to coordinate a neighborhood meeting, and they brought these assets together into a common place, or known as something else known as anchor points, and Craig and Shellie will talk more about that later. But anchor points, places that are familiar to these assets, such as schools, parks, or libraries. And so our officers had to work with the assets that they identified, to coordinate a time and place. And not only that, they took time to actually go out into all the neighborhoods and flyer. They took time to make phone calls, and they even took time to send emails. And so something very out of the ordinary for our officers. On top of that, some of our hotspots are apartments, and so we were very fortunate to have support from our apartment managers, and some of them even offered incentives for their tenants. So if their tenants were able to come to join one of our neighborhood meetings, they would receive like $50 off of their next month bill payment. So it was great. And so once they have brought the residents together and they start to initiate honest conversations. So just having honest dialogue, just talking about the concerns that the residents are having at their level, and during this time just being open to talk about anything. And so once they start to identify concerns, and then you move on to the last and final, which is you start to problem solve. You start to help the residents problem solve, and residents start to develop solutions. And so you work on developing what the police would do and what the neighborhood would do. And this is the most amazing process for me, because I've seen a lot of these hotspots develop, and it's just amazing to see residents become more engaging and more willing to do things together. And so once an action plan has been identified or solutions have been identified, then officers move on to the last and final stage, which is the take action stage. And this stage is where they actually implement the action plan. The residents and the officers, they implement their plan. And they continue to, and while implementing their action plan, the officers continue to have contact and maintain relationships with their residents by just checking in on them, asking them how things are going, did anything new come up, do we need to revise our action plan, what can we work on, and so just making sure that they're following up and keeping those relationships. And so I want to give two examples of our hotspot. One example is of our hotspot. It's 84th Avenue duplexes, and our street segment is the street segment within the red box right there. So it's just a very, very small street segments with about 40 units, and so all these houses are duplexes. And so our officers assigned to this street segment actually worked with the assets and actually called the assets ambassadors, which I thought was really creative. And so instead of using assets, they called them ambassadors. And what they did was they brought these ambassadors together and held multiple successful neighborhood meetings. And from those meetings, they learned that the neighborhood's concerns were really focused on speeding, because there's a lot of children within that street segment, and a lot of cars would drive by, just speed and not look out for the children. And also there were a lot of complaints around parking and loud music. And the officers and all the residents, or the ambassadors, put a plan together, and they agreed on that the residents would start to get to know each other more, so they can look out for each other more. And what was really astonishing was the residents took this one step further, and they created their own Facebook page to get to know each other. They did this out of the, without the help of the officers. They just initiated that, and so I thought that was astonishing. And on top of that, they also agreed within each other that they would call the officers directly, or they would call the police if issues arise. And I thought that was, to me, that was like the light in the tunnel, because not only were they willing to finally work together, I mean, they came together, they identified issues, and then they started to problem solve. And not only were they willing to work with each other, but now they were willing to cooperate and work with the police. And so that was great. And then on the police end, we agreed that we would do a speed study survey, which is currently in progress right now. Our city engineers just went out a couple of weeks ago to set up polls, and that's currently in progress. And we also agreed that we would work on responding to their parking complaints. Another example I have is of Strawberry Commons condominiums. These condominiums are half owners and half renters, and after putting together a neighborhood meeting, their concerns really revolved around that the population there was too transient, and so relationships were hard to build, that they couldn't really trust anyone. And they also felt that their association lacked interest in their safety and refused to install outdoor entrance locks. And they also had an issue with parking, with people parking in their fire lane. And so the thing with this specific hotspot was a lot of the residents feared retaliation if they reported incidents, because they felt that they didn't have anyone looking out for them. They felt that they couldn't trust anyone. They felt that if it was them reporting it alone, there would be retaliation. And so there wasn't any trust in these condos. And so after the neighborhood meeting, the police officers along with the residents agreed that the residents would actually start a petition, and they would actually present to their board and try to get their board to fund and get security locks installed. And they also agreed that they would start looking out for one another, and because they felt that they didn't have that trust, that there was no one they could lean on. And so they all agreed that they would start to initiate conversations, start to talk with each other, and start to depend on one another and look out for one another. And that was great for me. And so they also agreed that they would start reporting questionable leasing licenses to the city's licensing department. So a lot of great progress there. And on the police end, we said we would provide extra patrol and we would do more fire lane enforcements. And so these two examples are great examples of what's going on in Brooklyn Park. And I hope that through these examples, you, the listening audience, can see that it's not just about having a meeting, about bringing people together. I hope through these two examples you can see how the residents have changed from the beginning until the end. Residents now want to invest socially in their neighborhood, and now they're willing to cooperate and work with the police. And not only that, they're taking on the responsibility of crime prevention. They're willing to do things. They're willing to step up and solve problems. And so again, I hope that with this collective efficacy project, that the social cohesion and trust, and through all of this, residents will begin to exercise social controls and cooperation with the police. And so thank you for having me, and I hope the information that I've shared and what we're doing in Brooklyn Park will be beneficial to you, the listening audience. Craig, before I hand this over back to you and Shellie, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that was great. Thank you. And we'll take questions at the end also. Okay? So thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this last part is really a summation of what we've talked about here and what Wynn has just laid out as well. So what do you do? If you're a police department, where do you start and what do you do? And as we mentioned earlier, and as Wynn mentioned too, it's really engaging in the problem-solving process. Identifying the hot spots, identifying areas of concern are important starting points for this. We stress identifying hot spots that exist. They don't have to be large areas, as we said earlier. That in fact they can be and should be smaller and what we call micro targets. One of the things that we also emphasize here is that intervention through enforcement can take place initially. That part of it is to clear out an area. It is to prevent and deter gangs from engaging in their activities. And one example that I want to raise is with what happened in Los Angeles with Lemon Grove Park. And there, in that park, a lot of gang activity was going on with MS-13s, and this was in Hollywood. And so the police department over time began to enforce the law and make arrests and make drug busts and so on to clear out the area. The important part, though, is the follow-up that has to take place with that action. That I think the police need to recognize that they're not just clearing a park because of the drug activity or the gang activity. That they're clearing a park because, yes, they want people to come back and use it, and kids can come back and play and so forth. But more importantly than that, and what I see there is that, again, the networking that takes place in a park begins to build up. And that's what we really want to have happen, is that people get together and network and talk and share stories and share perhaps the problems that they've seen at this location, and then continue to keep it clear of that activity. A third component here is filling in. And in the previous slide, you saw where we had yellow areas and where collective efficacy was low. And really what could happen and should happen is that in those areas, police and community people and others really need to start getting in there and build public trust and social cohesion. And that's very similar to what Wynn talked about in their hotspots in Brooklyn Park, that building up public trust among residents and between police and the public is really important, that doing the meet and greet, that doing the knock and talks are essential to filling in, that they begin to address safety and other concerns. A fourth component then, after you fill in, you build. You design interventions, as Wynn indicated, that encourage outreach to community people, especially where low collective efficacy and social control exists, that you really do want to build up those relationships and expand existing social networks. And this certainly is where community organizations can play a role, where police can play a role, but also where individuals can play a role. Fifth is the notion, as I mentioned before, of increasing volunteerism, that engaging volunteers to do different activities on special projects really does help build trust among both the volunteers and residents and others who live in the area. One of the things also with Lemon Grove Park was that volunteers were asked to come to the park and help clean up and do a cleanup, and they spent the morning there cleaning up the place and periodically doing the same. And that kind of volunteerism is what we're talking about here. Sixth is identifying anchor points. And anchor points, as we've mentioned, are places to gather and network. And again, these are places, parks, schools, community rec centers, libraries, daycare centers, churches, synagogues, grocery stores even, are places where people come together and where people talk and network. And that's the importance of an anchor point. It's a positive place that may have been negative before, but now has been changed. And using that location as a hub for activities and other types of things are really what finally then leads to the trust and social cohesion and willingness to intervene that we are very much focused on. So lastly, I think that, again, trust is a fundamental part of this. And we can't overemphasize that enough, obviously. But I think it does help the police in terms of building relationships, and it certainly does build community and neighbors and people's belief in one another to start to engage in forms of social control. Okay, lastly, as a result of a lot of this research, we have written a book on this. It's certainly available on Amazon, but we can also provide it to you much cheaper than what they're selling it on Amazon for, and we're willing certainly to do that. Just send me an email, and I can give you more details on that. If you want the freebies of this, the reports are available online through the National Institute of Justice. The policy version, executive summary, and full technical report are available for free. You can pull those off the internet and read them and get them. Okay, and there's our contact information. we can also let you know how to contact Wynn as well, and we can send that out in a subsequent email. And then if there are any questions, we're happy to take them. Thank you for listening in, and thank you for paying attention. And if you do have questions, please let us know. We can answer them now or even online later. Chip, Shellie, I turn it back to you.
Okay. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, this is Chip Coldren again, everybody. We do have one question that showed up in the chat room here, and I think this is probably best directed towards Wynn. And it's just, what was the role of patrol officers in the ACT initiative, Wynn? So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Can they be a little bit more specific exactly about what the role? As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to make sure our patrol officers really, during their discretionary time or the time that they weren't answering calls, implement the three-stage act. And so what they would do is go out to their hot spots that they were assigned to with their team member, and is go through these 3 stages in the 1 year of intervention and implement 1 stage at a time at their hot spot. And by doing so, they would eventually help build collaborations with residents and within each other to enhance informal social control. I hope that answers it. If you could be a little bit more specific, yeah?
I can fill in a little bit if you'd like. I think one of the things that happens in Brooklyn Park is that they form teams of officers, right? When you had an evening and day shift officer involved, you also had a community relationship person, right?
Yeah, getting more specifically into the individual role as opposed to the team role. As with individual roles, like I mentioned earlier before, we have 1 day shift officer assigned and 1 night shift officer assigned. And so how the officers divided their responsibilities and role, which is very creative. They created a system that worked best for them, was they got together and they really figured out their hot spot. And then the officers really basically took ownership of identifying what their duties were, what would make sense for them. So the day shift officers, what they did was they went out actually and they would do knock and talks, because sometimes a lot of people don't actually open their doors at night around 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And so our day shift officers, their shift is from 6 in the morning until 6 p.m. at night. So what they would do is they would go out, do knock and talks, greet people, get to know people, introduce people to the evening officer. And then the evening officer, he would come in. His shift is from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. What he would do is he would, if people or families are home, he would go out and check in, see how people are doing. If kids are home from school, if parents are home from school and people are outside, he would continue going out and create relationships and build relationships and contact people. And it really depends on the patrol officers, their team, what really worked for them, and their site too, specifically, again, because our hotspots varied. We have some segments that are just residential, and then we have some that are business strips. And so those business strips, they would close down by the time the night shift officer came in, so around 7 o'clock. And so it would really depend on the team and how they divided up their responsibilities. It's amazing. It's patrol officers doing things that they've never done before. It's doing things outside of their norm.
Can I also add that the sergeants and lieutenants and inspectors play a huge role in overseeing a lot of this too. This is a department-wide effort that's going on in Brooklyn Park, and they committed to doing this over the last year at least. And that's the other impressive part about it, is it's a full-fledged effort from the chief down to officers as well as to civilians who are, part of the teams too.
Good. Thanks, everybody. There's another interesting question that came up in the chat room, and I think I would address this to Craig, Shellie, and or Wynn. The question is, have you experienced or have you attempted this kind of work on collective efficacy in a community where trust has eroded due to something very serious like a police shooting? And if so, how did that go?
We haven't done it yet, but we're going to be doing this in Miami-Dade, where shootings have taken place of police on citizens and in a particularly violent neighborhood in Miami-Dade. So that is a challenge. And at the same time, one of the things that we found in doing our surveys and observations is that there are pockets of individuals who are interested and who share these notions of willingness to intervene and have a high regard for their neighbors. And so we think that, that we can find people who are willing to engage and willing to build these relationships. Yes, it's a challenge, clearly. But one of the things we also learned was that we can't just stereotype a community based on the actions and perceptions of a few. And in fact, we found that there are in these micro areas people who do want to do something, and that's an inherent part of it. The other part I want to just mention too is that a police shooting again speaks directly to how the police need to overcome the perception that they are doing this kind of activity a lot, and they need to rebuild the relationship within the community. And so, for me, this becomes one tool that officers start to engage in and really make concerted efforts to overcome the negativism that goes on within those communities. So we'll see what happens, though. That's one of our concerns as well.
Yeah, I would say almost looking at it from another perspective, we know that there are locations in the country where there have been shootings, and the result of those shootings has not been severe or difficult or violent disruptions, and we suspect that in those communities is where some good collective efficacy exists to begin with. And we have to think about this as an initiative and as a process, and it's not something that you do in response to any particular event. It's something that you should be doing as part of the work that you do as police officers. There was a similar question that someone submitted just prior to the webinar, and when I might direct this at you as well. We know there are some communities where, for one reason or another, the residents just might not want to see the police there. Maybe they consider themselves an intensely private, community where they just don't feel they need them, or they don't want the cars roaming around, or maybe it is a community where trust has eroded. So, have you had some officers in Brooklyn Park encounter communities that were kind of resistant to this? And if so, how did they react, or how would you advise officers to react in those situations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Actually, we have. In one of our hotspots, it's a business strip, and they open from 8 in the morning and they close by 7 at night. And so when we first implemented this project, we received a lot of positive feedback about the project. The business owners were really excited about that, but when we got towards the second stage of the intervention, a lot of business owners started to feel hesitant about the program because they sensed that there was too much police presence and that too much police presence was scaring away their customers and that they were possibly losing business from that. And so we had to work with our officers, and our officers had to work too with the business owners to kind of figure out a medium. And so working out with, because not all residents and not all business owners feel that way. It's only a certain, so trying to figure out that balance of making sure that you're not overstepping any boundaries or any privacy or showing too much presence, but also at the same time making sure that you're also responding to the needs of the other residents and the other business owners. And so that was what we had to do, was trying to find that balance and finding that balance.
Thank you very much. We're actually at 1 minute past the hour now. I think we could probably handle another question or two if people want to stay on the line, but I don't know. Hildy, I know you had a question that someone had submitted. You want to just raise that for a minute, please?
Yes, this is probably for Craig or any of the others that want to answer this, but how do you actually assess the effectiveness of your collective efficacy efforts? Like, how do you measure these kind of amorphous concepts of social cohesion and community safety and those sorts of things?
Yes, okay. So one of the things we strongly advise with measurement are multi-methods, one of which would be community surveys. That we did community surveys in Miami-Dade and LA. I know other jurisdictions have done this as well. And part of it is to get at questions about willingness to intervene. And I can, by the way, make those surveys available to people if they'd like them. We can post those because they have very specific questions about what people are willing to do and in what situations they're willing to do them. I think in establishing a baseline and doing waves of those surveys allow you to measure what's changed and what is not within community perceptions. I also think that doing the observations of areas and we sent our research team and even trained volunteers and community people to go into the communities and look at and measure what goes on different street segments. So what's the physical nature of that area? What does it look like? How bad or good is the lighting? How much trash is on in the area? Because all of those contribute to fear of crime and other things, and also give you another sense of, does anyone care? And so again, doing that kind of work is very helpful. A third area is just in terms of measuring what the police do. And one of the things that is so good about what's happening in Brooklyn Park is that they're using SharePoint to elicit and obtain and get from police officers what they do on a daily, weekly basis, and be able to share with everyone the types of contacts they've had, how long they've talked to people, and the quality, I think, of what they've done. And right now we're looking at those measures to see how we might be able to put together an instrument that really measures collective efficacy from the police point of view, and show how they've gone through these different stages and steps of implementation, so that again, we have something more precise and more exact about what can be done, what seems to work, and how effective they are in doing this.
Good. Thank you, Craig. I'd like to ask if if Charlotte Gill from George Mason University, if you're still on the line, might you talk for a minute about, the work that you're doing in Brooklyn Park on the research side? Okay, I'm not sure if Charlotte's still there.
Yeah.
And we have another question. Probably this is a good one for you and Shellie, Craig, about whether this has been implemented in an urban setting.
Urban setting. Well, Los Angeles, in Hollywood, that's part of what's going on now. As part of the Byrne Criminal Justice Innovation Program, the Youth Policy Institute is engaging in activities within 2 neighborhoods. One is in Pacoima, and the other one is in Hollywood, in the Hollywood section of Los Angeles. So we're looking at that now. We're trying to analyze data in and around the areas that they've selected. We've provided them with data. In the beginning also, they conducted neighborhood surveys within these areas and focus groups and town meetings so that we had a very good idea of how much collective efficacy was or wasn't going on within these specific locations. And each of these neighborhoods, by the way, are multiracial, very, very diverse. A number of the surveys were done in Spanish and other languages, I might add, too. So that's been our experience so far. We don't have outcome measures just yet about the effectiveness of what's been going on. But I would say that, yeah, Los Angeles is pretty urban.
I just would add, in the work that we're doing in Miami, while we haven't done a full-scale implementation, but Miami and LA both, in the areas where the trust is eroded in terms of our surveys, the 2 things that have jumped out is, one is that in doing the one-on-one conversations is the need to give some sense of anonymity to allow the residents to build up some courage to collaborate and to make things simple in terms of they don't know their neighbors. So very simple introductions one-on-one is one of the ways that we've started to pilot it, where they literally don't know the person across the street. So to ask them to come to a big meeting is very, very scary. And we're seeing this, and then one of the pastors that I've worked with has had things where people can actually, answer questions using a button so they can talk about violence without even revealing who they are. And they really like these types of sessions. So.
Okay. Thank you. I think we do have Charlotte Gill available to respond to how they're doing the research in Brooklyn Park. So, Charlotte, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And can you repeat the question? I was distracted trying to unmute myself.
It's just a question about how collective efficacy is being measured.
Sure. I definitely think, as Craig and others said before, the community surveys are really crucial for this. Obviously, this is something that it's very difficult to get to through sort of the traditional way of looking at crime incidents and calls for service. And one of the things that we are keeping in mind is that as collective efficacy increases, we may actually see an increase in calls for service. Wynn talked a little bit about how residents of some of the areas were banding together and agreeing to call on the police more as they got to know the police and began to gain trust in them. So what we really want to try and do through our community surveys is to try and tease out, how people see the neighborhood is, sorry, not the neighborhood, but the hotspot is improving in terms of their relationships with neighbors, their feelings that people are available to help each other out. And then also what we are intending to try to do as well is to capture a little bit more information about their experiences of crimes and victimization that are happening to them to try and tease out whether we do actually have a reporting effect. So that's definitely something to keep in mind for those of you who are interested in measuring these kind of approaches, is thinking about what might be the impact. If you're seeing increased calls for service, that's not necessarily a bad thing in these types of interventions. Anything else, Chip, that you would like me to say about that?
No, that's fine. I appreciate it. Thank you. We're We're at 10 minutes after the hour now, and so I just think, yes. Oh, okay. I was just going to say that I think we should probably close the webinar at this point to respect everybody's time. But I would ask that you complete the evaluation, and because we still have almost 80 people on the line here, if there's interest in pursuing this discussion further, maybe through another webinar with a slightly more focused approach, please let us know, and we'd be happy to put that together. Let me just say again that Craig and Shellie and Wynn, thank you very much for putting together a really good presentation for today. I know those of us in smart policing find this to be an incredibly interesting topic, and I hope everybody else found it to be interesting as well. Vivian and Zoe and Hildy and everybody who participated in the planning and the rehearsals, thank you all very much. I think it's been a great session today.